So the talk today is solving the availability-finality dilemma, or how to fix the ETH 2.0 consensus protocol. This is joint work with my graduate student at Stanford, Joachim and Nurest Tas. So our story started about 6 months ago when this paper by Vitalik and his co-authors came up, combining Ghost and Cassper. So this paper is about a new protocol called Cassper, which is the current candidate for the ETH 2.0 beacon chain. It's a pretty complex protocol. It combines Cassper FFG, which is a finality tool, with LMD Ghost, which is a fork choice rule. So a lot of jargon, sounds really complicated. So we spent quite a bit of time trying to understand why is this protocol so complicated. If it's a consensus protocol, why doesn't it use an off-the-shelf consensus protocol, but have to design one from scratch? So after a few months of investigation, we came to two conclusions. Number one is that this protocol is actually not secure. We find a liveness attack on the protocol, so it may stall forever. And number two, we were able to reverse engineer its goal of Cassper, and we find an optimal solution, which we can prove to be secure. So this talk is about how we solve that problem. So we have to go a little bit back to get started. And we observed that in the world of blockchains, there are basically two types of consensus protocols out there. On the left, we have the Nakamoto-style longest chain. Prime examples is Bitcoin, Ethereum 1.0, as well as newer blockchains like Cardano's or Boris, proof-of-stake protocols. On the right-hand side, we have Bft protocols. Some names that you may have heard of is PBFT, Tendermint, Hot Stuff, and Algorand. So these two types of protocols are really quite different. On the Bft protocols are invented over a history of about 40 years, whereas the Nakamoto-style longest chain is quite modern, 10 years. But actually, in addition to the history, more importantly, there is actually a very significant difference between these two protocols. And I would like to highlight the difference. So let's first talk about Bft protocol. So here's roughly how it works. So I have a whole network of nodes here, peer nodes here, to try to come to consensus on the blockchain. So let's look at the blockchain from the view of one particular node, one particular validator. So blocks are being proposed from different nodes of the network, okay? And each time a block is proposed, the other validators vote on this block. And if you get enough votes, then this block can be viewed as finalized, and the process continues, okay? So another block is proposed, people vote on it. But now suppose, from the point of view of this node, suddenly the number of validators dropped a lot. And all he saw is a very small number of votes, very small number of signatures. So in that case, the Bft protocol will stall, okay? It will not continue until there are enough signatures. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that the assumption is that of this node is that there's actually a network partition happening here. And there's another set of nodes in another part of the network which is not talking to the network that this node sees. And they're busy growing another chain and trying to finalize another chain. And so therefore, if this the left chain is finalized with a small number of votes, then it could happen that the other chain will show up later and reverse all the transactions that was made. So therefore, it has to be safe and under network partition. And this is what we call final under network partition. Okay, so this is the Bft protocol. On the other hand, we have the longest chain protocol, okay? Nakamoto-style longest chain protocol. And in Nakamoto-style longest chain protocol, again, we have a network of nodes. In the proof of work setting, these are miners. In the proof of stake setting, these are validators. So again, from the point of view of one of them, one of the node, what do I see? So I see this blockchain growing, okay? And blocks is being proposed, appended to the longest chain. And this process continues, okay? And even when the number of nodes drop significantly, okay, the blockchain will grow slower, but the blockchain will continue, okay? And it will keep on continuing. So the behavior is actually very different from the Bft protocol that we saw earlier, where the whole chain stopped. Here it keeps on continuing and is said to be available under dynamic participation, okay? So this is one big difference between longest chain and the Bft protocol. Longest chain keeps on growing, always available. And for example, in Bitcoin, has been around for more than 10 years now. It never stopped growing, just keeps on growing. So it's always available under dynamic participation. Whereas Bft protocols can stop, okay? And so these two protocols are actually, types of protocols are actually very different, okay? All right, so let's put them all together. And let's look at the situation where now I have nodes, okay? The nodes are varying, the number of nodes are varying, okay, between 0 and 100% of the nodes, and here I'm plotting it as a function of time. And an important threshold is the number 67, okay? 67% is actually the number of validators that need to sign on the block for Bft protocol to continue, okay? So now let's look at what happens on the longest chain. As we saw earlier, it keeps on growing, and here I'm plotting the ledger, the length of the ledger with time, and you can see that no matter what, even when there's low participation, network partition, the chain keeps on growing no matter what. Dynamic availability, very good. On the other hand, Bft protocol will stop growing when there's network partition or low participation, and when there's high participation and no partition, then it will grow and continue to grow, okay? So the reason why these two protocols behave so differently under the same network setting is because they're making two different set of trust assumptions. The participant in the longest chain protocol is an optimist. And the optimist says that if I don't hear from many peers, it's just because these other peers went offline and they were doing nothing. And so I can keep on confirming. I can keep on continuing the blockchain. On the other hand, a node that runs a Bft protocol are a pessimist. And here, when it doesn't hear from nodes, then he thinks that these peers that we don't hear from are actually plotting against me, growing another chain invisible to him. And so to be conservative, it needs to stop confirming, okay? So two different set of trust assumptions. So both property, dynamic availability, and finality are actually good properties. Nothing wrong with them. A chain which is dynamic available keeps on growing, like Bitcoin. Finality means that when you confirm a block, then nothing will happen in the future that would reverse that transaction, okay, in the block. So these two are very good property. So the real interesting question is the following. Is there a consensus protocol that can provide both availability and finality? Okay. Now, if you look at the picture on the left and right, the behavior of such a protocol has to, which is a protocol which is dynamically available, has to keep on going forward, even with a network partition. Whereas a protocol that provides finality has to stop during network partition or during low participation. So therefore, it is clear that it is impossible to have a single protocol that can both be available and finality. because it's impossible for the ledger of that protocol to behave differently under the same condition. So therefore, it's impossible. And you may have heard people mention the word cap theorem. And it turns out that there is indeed a connection between this impossibility result with the cap theorem. But it's actually a pretty intuitive result as well. That's what I want to highlight. Okay, so here we are. And this sets up the so-called availability-finality dilemma. So why is it a dilemma? Because you want to achieve both these properties, but you cannot. So that's pretty sad. And that's why it's a dilemma. And so what we find out is basically that GASPA is essentially trying to solve this dilemma. And in our work, we formulate the problem precisely. And we came up with a formulation of how to overcome, how to resolve this dilemma. And here's how it works. So imagine you have a protocol that creates a ledger, and this ledger is available. So it keeps on growing. Now I know because of the negative result, the dilemma, I cannot make this entire ledger final at all times. Not possible. However, what I can do is I can make a prefix of this ledger final. Okay. So effectively now I have a ledger that has a prefix. The whole ledger is available, but the prefix is final. So in other words, the prefix can survive network partition, whereas the ledger may become unsafe during, the available ledger may become unsafe during network partition, but the available ledger keeps on growing. So if you plot as a function of time, the length of these two ledgers, the available ledger and the prefix in blue, then you will see the situation, which is the available ledger keeps on growing, while the finalized ledger will sometimes stop. For example, when you hear very few votes, but when the level of participation or the network partition ends, the finalized ledger will catch up to the available ledger, and then the two will be in sync again. So you can imagine now that you can use it this way. You have some clients who have important transactions, and those he wants to confirm only if that transaction is in the finalized prefix. Whereas if there are transactions which are not that viable, safe liveness is important. So then as long as it's in the available ledger, it's okay. You can continue, get on with life. So we call this property app and flow because the prefix, the finalized prefix and the available ledger, apps and flow with respect to each other. So now we have the question, and the interesting question therefore is, well, can we build a protocol which satisfies this app and flow property? Now, actually, you may have heard of this concept called finality gadget. Okay, so finality gadget was invented about 4 years ago by Vitalik and co-author called Casper FFG. And you can think of finality gadget has multiple purposes, but one application you can think of is to create such an app and flow protocol. So basically, roughly, it works like this, okay? You have blocks being proposed like an available protocol, like a longest chain. And at the same time, on top of that, you have a voting mechanisms where you put votes. And if you have enough votes, you finalize those blocks. And it keeps on continuing. And if you don't have enough signatures, you still keep on continuing, but the blocks are not finalized, only available. So hereby, you can create this prefix property. Now, if I explain it this way, it seems like the problem is kind of trivial. I mean, what's the big deal? It turns out, though, this problem is actually quite complicated. And here's an example why it's complicated. So you have the same situation again, where you have a block finalized. But now, suppose you have a situation where, according to the available, the red blocks, you have one fork, which is longer. And therefore, if you follow the longest chain, you should follow this right fork. On the other hand, if you follow this right fork, you will lose the finalized blocks. You will not have the prefix relationship. And so now you have a dilemma, another dilemma, which is, okay, which fork to go on? So the whole challenge of this problem is to really figure out how to decide on which the path to go. So in other words, you can't really follow just the pure BFT protocol or the pure longest chain protocol. You have to do a compromise between two. And a lot of these works, for example, Polkadot's Grandpa, Caspar FFG, and Gaspar itself, is really how to handcraft a protocol to try to achieve this compromise. And it's a very complicated problem. And that's one reason why Gaspar we could find an attack, is because you have to handcraft a protocol from scratch. You can't use an off-the-shelf protocol anymore. You can't use an off-the-shelf BFT or off-the-shelf longest chain protocol, okay? So that's why this part is quite complicated. Lots of proposals out there, but really not quite sure whether they're secure. So we took a totally different approach to solve this problem, totally different. Instead of trying to add a finality gadget on top of a longest chain protocol and have to modify the fork choice rule, we took a different approach. We said, hey, our solution is called Snap and Chat. So here's what we do. First, we take two off-the-shelf protocol, okay? So we don't do any joint handcraft design. We take two longest chain, two off-the-shelf protocol, one longest chain, for example, it could be proof of work or a Boris proof of stake longest chain, doesn't matter, longest chain protocol. And then we take an off-the-shelf BFT protocol. It could be PBFT. It could be more modern, hot stuff. Doesn't matter, two off-the-shelf. And then we can compose them together as follows. So first, we pass the transactions into the longest chain. And the output of the longest chains are the dynamic ledger that was generated by longest chain. And what we do is we take snapshots of this growing ledger from the longest chain, always growing because it's dynamic, and then run it through the off-the-shelf BFT protocol, which now attempts to finalize this ledger. And the output of the BFT, we call that the finalized prefix. So the finalized prefix is the output of the BFT. And then we take the snapshot of the longest chain and concatenate it with the finalized prefix. And together, they form the available ledger. Now, this concatenation process has to be done carefully. And the reason is because there may be already transactions in the finalized prefix that appears again in the available ledger. So we have to go through a sanitization process. But the point is that we give priority to the finalized transactions. And the transactions from the snapshots of the output of longest chain have to take second-class citizen, and then they have to fit in to form the final available ledger. And what we showed is that this system is actually very secure. In fact, we showed that the finalized prefix can be proven secure under even network partition as long as there are less than 33% adversary. And the full ledger is proven secure under dynamic participation with 49% online nodes adversary. These two conditions are actually the optimal security conditions for each of the two ledger separately. So what we showed is that given with this prefix condition, both are still optimally secure. Great. So that's the end of the talk. If you want to read more about our work, please take a look at the paper, the App and Flow protocol. And if you're interested in attack, we just put it up on the Ethereum blog, research blog. and where we detailed the attack on Gaspa. So thank you very much.